So good morning. This is my first time here. I'm very honored to be invited to speak to such an august group here in Denmark of a collection of the software architects. I'm told you're all software people. I also do some work with real architects. I've done some work with Christopher Alexander. I've done a little bit of work with the Johan Utzon crowd. Got involved with them right before his death, though I never met him in person. And so this relationship between the built world and our world has always fascinated me. I'll say just a little bit more about that later. I don't know you very well. I think I know a couple of folks here from the past. But now that you've sat down, everybody stand up. If you have not written code in the past month, please sit down. HTML is not code. How about what? PowerPoint is not code. If you have not talked to an end user of your product, about your product in the past month, please sit down. End user, not customer. Okay, so here are the architects. Okay, so about a third or a fourth of you. Well, thank you very much. Please sit down. Make yourself at home. I mean, as you can probably tell from the book, I'm from the Agile community. I'm older than I look. Wrote my first code in the early 1970s, and have done a lot of things over the years. I'm a programming language person. I've been involved in a lot in organizational design, which is most of what I do today. But also have done a lot of work in architecture together with my wife, Gertrud Bjørvig. We did an architecture book together. That's inspired a lot by lean principles and inspired by the work of Trygve Reinskov, who's a wonderful Norwegian guy. How many of you know who Trygve is? And you're architects, right? He invented an architectural framework, something pretty cool called Model View Controller, which, I mean, if any of you are, what are you doing here?
I got back from Mexico just to hear you talking.
Oh, okay. When's the last I saw you? It's been years and years and years ago. Wow.
No, we talked about Java.
Oh, it was at Jau, right. Yeah. May it rest in peace. What I'm going to talk about today is what I see as being some of the major gaps in, if I can call architecture a profession, which it's really not, in dealing with change, in dealing with the end user, and having end knowledge. Now, architecture is really not a profession. It really never has been. Brunelleschi was a painter. Some of them were lawyers. Some of them were other things. And they built stuff, so they called them architects, which is a tautology that explains nothing. And I'll come back to that in the end of my talk. So architect is not a verb in English. So what do architects do? I ask them that, and they say, well, we architect. Well, no. What's the verb?
Build.
Build is good. I like build. Architects build things. But the thing...
Draw?
No, drawing is one way of... In fact, it was... who was it who said... that the art of drawing and the art of building are not one and the same. This is Bramante or some famous architect who said this. And we often confuse this. And this is the PowerPoint architect who really doesn't understand. It's about building. The verb I usually use is design, but I like build. This is why I asked if you'd written code. So one of the strong correlations we found in our research of 10 years of research in Bell Labs is that architects on successful products write code. On other products, they throw them over the wall in UML or whatever the convention is of choice. But within that framework of an architect who really builds stuff, like architects in the built world always have, what I'd like to do is challenge us here, and what I'm trying to do is give you some ideas to fuel the discussions in the open space today. So I notice there's a lot of technology things on the wall here, and it looks more like engineering than architecture. What I'd like to do is raise the bar a little bit ideologically and think about what our role is in development and as an architect, or let me say domain expert. I love having domain experts. To me, everyone on the team is an architect. Every line of coding changes the design. Every line of coding changes the form of the system. Architecture is about code. It's about form. So if you are not an architect, you don't belong on the implementation team. Therefore, I think architect is becoming more and more of an undistinguished title. And I'll say more about that later. There are actually some pragmatic business reasons as to why this is true. And this has to do with deep knowledge. And we should be concerned that you're not in the code. Architects implement. Architects have their hands dirty. And this is a real telling property of disciplines that work, that are successful. In Toyota, Taiichi Ohno, the founder of a lot of modern Toyota, has put up a sign in Toyota that says, "You may come into the boardroom with clean hands." Other than that, if you're a manager, we expect your hands to be dirty. We expect you to be down on the gemba. We expect you to be in the machine. So this is what the chief engineers are like in Toyota. And this is what architects are like on a software product. Now, just to establish some common ground, where does this come from? I think the original idea of adopting architecture as a metaphor came from Fred Brooks at IBM. And he and Jerry Weinberg were talking, and Fred said, what we do is an awful lot like what architects do in the built world. Do you think this is a good metaphor? And Jerry said, yeah, and they talked about it a little bit, and the metaphor kind of stuck. Architecture is about form. So it's more about the process by which we make something than the thing itself. So we're looking at the overall shape of something, and will this accommodate user needs? Now, how does shape accommodate user needs? Well, if you're looking at the human interface of a graphical application, you should be able to see the architecture. Okay, this is called the direct manipulation metaphor. How many of you do object-oriented programming? What language? Java is the only language in which you cannot do object-oriented programming. Huh? Other languages. Smalltalk, no. What? C#, no. Python, no. No. Erlang. I mean a real language. Any JavaScript programmers here? Here are my object-oriented programmers. They're writing objects. The rest of you are writing classes. What is object-oriented programming? It has nothing to do with encapsulation and polymorphism and cohesion. Polymorphism is a term from biology, which is the ability of a species to change sex in the scarcity of the opposite sex so there can be reproduction.
We could do the same.
You can do the same. Oh, that'd be an interesting experiment anyhow. Object-oriented programming came from Alan Kay and the notion that the structure of the system is an extension of the human mind. So the objects in the system reflect structures in the human mental model so that the machine becomes an extension of self. This is what object-oriented architecture is about. Now, that means to be an architect, you should probably be a cognitive psychologist. You should probably be doing good domain analysis, and you should be talking to your end users to elicit their end user mental models. The rest of you are just doing structured programming with structs and modules. So again, there's this issue of deep expertise. And where does the form come from? Now, often, if I look at the signs along the wall, wow, all kinds of high-tech terms. DevOps, Agile. DevOps, again, I mean, it's about the technology. And now technology is important. Christopher Alexander, as a building architect, is very proud of having pioneered sprayed concrete buildings instead of building frame buildings or brick buildings. And it gives him a lot of flexibility. But also what's important is, again, this end user's mental model. What is a house going to be used for? How will it evolve? So we're looking at this form, and if we go way back to Vitruvius and Palladio, the original, kind of architectural writers, they talk about architecture as being about three things: utilitas, firmitas, and venustas. Utilitas, it's useful. It serves a purpose. It has value. Firmitas, the first woodpecker that comes along is not going to destroy the house. It balances the forces of wind, of gravity, of fear, of security, of beauty, of warmth, of comfort. And venustas, this wonder, this delight, this happiness, this feeling at home. The Japanese, I do a lot of work in Japan, where the architecture is fantastic. It's called Mume no Shitsu. It's the nameless quality. You can't name it. It's not beauty, it's not wholeness. It's just this thing that makes you feel right. How many of you have lived in beautiful code? Wonderful feeling, isn't it?
Yes.
That's architecture. The rest of you don't have venustas. Maybe you have firmitas, utilitas, so maybe you're engineers. Now, this kind of foundation has led, I think, to three serious problems in architecture today. One is change, another is support for the end user, and the other is deep knowledge. So change today comes at a high cost and usually with high technical debt. And there's this wonderful, Passer agire till alt men nej, det så fogligt nej. In fact, Agile, how many of you do not work for an Agile corporation? Or really, if I asked your CEO, they'd say, no, we're not Agile? I mean, how do you measure this? How can you tell? It's a ridiculous question. All right? In fact, the big problem of many organizations, as you might appreciate as people who call yourself architects, is that they are too agile. They do not have constancy of purpose. They do not have stability. And so, hey, change is free. Let's just go and make change to the system, and you end up with a lot of technical debt. You end up not being able to understand the system anymore. Support for the end user. I mean, I remember, from 20 or 30 years ago, at least I could go to the Finnair reservation site and be able to make a reservation. Or, SAS. SAS is getting worse and worse. And today's software really sucks compared to what we used to make. And we say, yeah, it's more complex. And OK, maybe. I'm not sure I buy that argument. But, we're making software that just does not support a good user experience, with very rare exceptions. I bought a taxi here, and the new taxi app seemed pretty reasonable. So someone there knew what they were doing. But most designs do not support usability. And why? We think usability is the UX people's problem. It's the ACI people's problem. No, you cannot hide a bad architecture behind an interface. It will show through. And this ends in cognitive dissonance and ends in surprises. And the last thing you want, unless you are building a video game, is to surprise the end user. End users hate surprises. So I want a link from that architecture to the mental model of the user and the interface should be as thin as possible to not get in the way of me interacting with the architecture. It's like I'm moving things around in the architecture. And last, deep knowledge. So we still treasure specialization. So someone here is maybe a specialist in Java or in DevOps or in some deep technology. And knowledge compartmentalization. We still have this. I find this all over the place. I mean, I'm not going to tell you about my expertise because I might get fired, or I might lose my job, or I might lose respect if I do not have the sole expertise on this topic. If you know it, well, then you're going to be able to do the same thing I do. And I know you will not do as well, so I'm not going to share my knowledge with you. So we have UX people, we have coding people, we have quality people, and we have design people. And too often, they're in stovepipes where they just talk to each other through documents and meetings rather than having teamwork. So stability and change is the first one. And I think most of you recognize this, that the current fad, which is Agile, is to focus on change and to ignore stability. I mean, nowhere in the Agile manifesto will you see anything about constancy of purpose, invariance, treasuring what doesn't change. So we embrace change, say the extreme programming people. Well, we also embrace stability. And this is culture, right? So, we have stable families. And if we're having a divorce or if someone in the family dies, this is viewed as an unfortunate situation, not as a blessing. So there are things that we value for stability. If there's a reorganization that's unstable, we get a new CEO, someone changes the organizational structure. It's the stability that allows us to have a context in which we can get work done. So instead of looking at investment, which is what good architecture is largely about, it's a cost economy, a cash flow economy. And so this is very strongly driven by economics. And in the current market, which is a dog-eat-dog market, and features are competing with each other on the basis of weeks and months, and sometimes hours. Anyone here work for a gambling company? I work with, if you have online gambling algorithms, your competition has them. You have to keep up with their advances in the algorithms and the data. I've done some work with, they used to be called EGET. They're now called PATH, Finnish public gambling company. And they're doing releases hour by hour. And so it's very difficult to focus both on that need for change and to keep the architecture constant. And this is a rather pessimistic world. Well, I don't know if there will be a world tomorrow when I wake up. So I cannot afford to worry about the future. I need to survive now. The other thing is we're using stock paradigms versus really understanding the shape of the market. So I've talked about mental models, but even if you're not a psychologist, you should be able to go out and look at your many releases of a system and say, here's what's in common across the releases. Here's what's common across the customers or across our markets. And here are the parameters of change. And then if you know these two things, you can select the right paradigm. So the object paradigm is just one paradigm that captures one particular set of categories of commonality and parameters of variation. So if the behavior of something maintains the same, but the algorithms by which that behavior are implemented change, then the object paradigm is good for you. So you have many windowing systems. You have Microsoft windowing systems. You have X Windows. You have a Mac windowing system. What you do on a windowing system is always the same. Draw lines, draw text, and so forth. But the implementation is different. Perfect for the object paradigm. But there are other paradigms, too. There's rule-based paradigms. There's a procedural paradigm. There's a database paradigm. And too often these are done for historic or political reasons rather than being based on good analysis. I have no idea what object-oriented analysis is. I mean, this is an oxymoron. I mean, analysis is trying to find out the shape of my application, the shape of my market. Object-oriented programming is a way to reflect a certain kind of analysis in the implementation. But analysis should be without regard to the fact that I might use objects or modules or databases or rules. It's understanding. Objects are about design. And too often, architects will be stovepiped in an object world, and they're going out, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're an object-oriented person, everything looks like an object. And we end up with procedures they're essentially objects. And this hurts us on stability because it's building shapes that do not evolve. They are not stable. Their form is not stable under evolution. And we end up with a mess.
I was a bit surprised you put object-oriented and microservices like in the same category. For me, microservices will be putting organization responsibility
Where did I say microservices?
at the bottom next to object-oriented.
Oh, I mean, it's also ridiculous. It's a fad.
For other reasons, do you agree?
It's a fad. I mean, just recently, it was on Twitter about 3 days ago where someone said, you know, we have, what?
1,500.
How many microservices? Well, you saw this, the quote that Grady Booch commented on, 1,300 microservices, each one of which represents a rule. And Grady Booch said, this is just so wrong. I mean, no one can understand the system. And it's an environment that's fueled by kind of the social mores, the me generation of the 1980s, which has now grown up and is now the mature and gray-haired folk in this room. And this notion of teamwork or of having a joint perspective on the overall form has given way to, this is mine, all mine. This is my rule. This is my microservice. And yeah, I mean, by sheer force of will, we make these things work for the same reason that Y2K didn't result in the end of the world. You know, you put enough effort into these things, you can make anything work. But there is a more joyous, more evenly flowing way of doing things. What should be our touchstone is the end user, not the customer. All the customer wants is their 10 million Danish crowns. And as long as they can recover that money from their end users, they're happy. And they want you to use this technology or this branding. No, I mean, a good architect understands the end user, just like the architect of a house is going to talk by the people who are living in that house. I mean, Ian Pei was a great architect. He just died this year. And he made these immaculately designed, perfect houses with all the furniture and everything. And someone once interviewed him and said, have you ever gone back and looked at one of these houses like 10 years later after you've designed it? He says, oh no, there'd be people there. And so he's an artiste, right? Not an architect. Utilitas. It's about being practical. It's about being useful. Not just venustas, not just it's a work of art. So we want to understand this end user. So the end user has a mental model of how the world works. So I have a model of an airline reservation that I'm going to make and where I'm going to be flying and where my seat will be. And the model comprises business logic and state and geometry and all these kind of things. So what we want, if a system is going to be implementing this model and serving us, for example, to make an airline reservation, I want the model of the system to be as isomorphic to the end user's mental model as possible. Well, this is a problem. I know I'd love to go into Paul's mind and directly manipulate the neurons, but it'd be really messy. So we work through this interface, right? Ears, eyes, mouth. And so we need this interface in between that bridges the impedance mismatch between wetware and the software. So we put in the middle what is called a tool. And the tool will take the data that are in this model and present them to the end user through something called a view, which is going to give the user access to the remote data. And there may be several views of this data. Here's a pie chart view. Here's a bar chart view. Each one of these is a view on these data. And then I will allow the user to edit these data either through the view or through the controller. How many of you use MVC? How many of you think that the controller processes input? Totally wrong. I mean, that is not what MVC is. Input can come in through the view as well. Model, view, controller, user. We have renamed this to MVCU because it's the user that is the important object in the system that is the reason that we're doing this. Now, what was that? Okay. This should be the architecture of any object-oriented system. And then the rest is just details. It's just noise. But I mean, this is your architecture. This is how we get this engagement between the end user and the system. You start here. And now you do domain analysis to find out what the object should be. And then finally, oh yeah, we have classes that we may use to make the objects. But even that is not quite right. Classes are a terrible, terrible, terrible accident of history. They should never have been invented. They were invented first in Smalltalk as kind of an efficiency just to get something off the ground running. About the same time, they'd come in Simula, but Simula goes all the way back to about 1965, and it wasn't object-oriented until 2 or 3 years later. And Dahl and Newgold basically did Simula in order to get funding to write an ALGOL compiler. They called it research. But they didn't put the object-oriented part in until later. And they kept this notion of classes, which have really destroyed our ability to engage end user in building objects that reflect the end user concept of what the world is about.
Can I ask a question?
You just did. Another one, yeah. Yeah, great.
Your position regarding that question. Something similar to distinguishing between objects and classes is distinguishing between values and types. Similar, it's not the same thing. Presumably, you want some kind of, at least I would have some kind of type system if you don't have classes to give you some of the same sort of compile time or coding time or whatever.
Well, type systems are another one of these things. Again, you're the technologist, like these things on the wall here. Type systems are based on retract theory. Smalltalk is probably one of the most strongly typed languages we have. Now, it's very weakly type checked. And there's a difference between having a runtime type system, which is a way of wiring up method selectors with the right object, and a type checking system to make sure that things fit together. And most of the religious wars about strong typing and strongly typed languages confuse these two.
I don't think it's just hype. I think that there are some tangible benefits in having types.
Well, name me an object-oriented programming language that is not strongly typed. They're all strongly typed. That's the definition of object-oriented programming, because I'm able to dispatch a method selector to the right object. That's what a type system is for. Okay?
JavaScript and Ruby, they are duck typed.
They are very strongly typed.
Duck typed.
Well, it's still, no, they're duck typed, but they're very strongly typed. And I think what you mean is type checked. Now, there is some anecdotal evidence, and actually there was some research done in, when was this? 1992 by Dwayne Perry and Gail Kaiser that showed a correlation, an inverse correlation between bugs and well-defined interfaces. And type checking is one way of implementing well-defined interfaces. And so there is something there for large projects. But that's not what I'm talking about. this whole issue of type checking and strong typing and objects in classes is quite an involved area.
I'm just saying that I think if you take out classes, you may take out something else also that would stay.
Well, no. What if I have roles instead? What if I have interfaces instead? A Java interface is not a class, but it's extremely strongly typed. You see, we as architects, as human beings, we like to simplify because we communicate with our stakeholders, with the programmers, and wow, it's going to be messy to talk about interfaces because programmers know what a class is. If I start to talk about interfaces, I can have an interface that'll talk to objects of multiple kind of classes. Oh my gosh, that is not a nice German hierarchy anymore. And now I cannot accommodate a highly tuned hierarchical Western model that's easy to spoon feed. Because now we're moving out of the realm of complicated into complex. And modern software systems are complex. So a simple hierarchy is complicated. Classes may be okay as long as nothing changes for complicated systems. But in a complex system where I have emergent behavior, I have a directed acyclic graph. And then a chaotic system is not even acyclic anymore.
I'm just wondering, because you say that, I think that when a human has to deal with as many abstractions as exist, they have to do qualification. So qualification will always be one of the things where like type systems come in and where the interfaces come in and so on. So from a mental model, from a user perspective, he will start building pictures. Some of these are actually related. So they say, oh, I want this, I want that. They're all classifications of things. So in that end, that is also typing.
So a lot of buzzwords there. And it's a nice hypothesis. Take 10 years and do some research and gather some data, and then let's talk again. I'm a researcher. Any claim I make, I can back up with research data or formal proof. Now, too often when I talk to architects, I'll end up in a conversation like this. Well, wouldn't it be nice if? Great, nice hypothesis. Let's do an experiment. An experiment has control, an experimental, a hypothesis, has measures, has experimental variables, control variables, and let's do an experiment and measure. So again, I'm a Scrum person. Scrum is an empirical framework. It's based on measurement and on formal proof, not just on intuition, because our intuition too often leads us wrong. A lot of my work is cleaning up after the fruits of people's intuition, like class-oriented programming, which we confuse with objects, test-driven development, which we confuse with assertions.
It can also be personal experience. I admit that's not a good thing to drive compared to research, but it's more than intuition.
It is intuition by definition. And all the psychological research shows that people who do this individually are so subject to confirmation bias. I mean, look at the research on estimation that come out of the Simula Center. What's his name? From the Jørgensen, Manu Jørgensen. He made a graph, and he took it to the talking head object-oriented, or no, agile people of Europe. And there were points on the graph for agile and non-agile projects. And he said, you're an expert. Do you feel these data show that agile is superior? And 80% of the respondents who were agile talking heads said yes. The data were random. This is the problem with individuals, and research has borne it out. Quaderat demonstrandum.
That was last time you were talking about people being siloed and experts. You also had the notion of deep knowledge.
We'll get to that.
Good, thank you.
Yep. All right. But I just wanted to make this point about the engagement between the developer and the end user.
This is more common because we're so keen on looking into compile time checking with type checking. At the same time, we've largely moved from strongly type checked XML values in the microservices towards JSON, which is actually absolutely not checked.
Yep.
I think it's curious.
That's interesting. Again, there's a good research program here, and to look at the quality, the evolvability in this migration. Does it work? Does it not work? What parts of it work and what parts of it do not? So yeah, there are some interesting things here that would be interesting to understand.
A bit late and a bit stupid, but how do you write an object? Why are classes just not a tool for programmers for creating objects? I mean, what's the problem?
The problem is adaptability. So people work in time. And in time, things change. So before, you were just a registered attendee. Now, you're a correspondent. So you have changed role. You're the same object, but I'm now working with you through a different interface, a different API than I was before. If that API is in a class, I'm stuck with you as just being a registered attendee with a name badge. But now I can change your...
Created at some point.
Oh yeah, you do, and you're created as a blob of DNA. Now, as time evolves, you can take on different types. Types are a dynamic property of an object. In one context, you're a father. In another, you're a question answer. In another, you're just a registrant for this. So type is not a property of the class. It's a property of the interaction between the user of the object and the object. And it changes per object over time. Now, we have a lot of architectural tricks for dealing with this, like wrappers. And I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the psychology that leads us to systems that are just a mess, because we believe that all problems in computer science reduce to what's in a name and can be solved by one more level of indirection. So we have these levels of it. Oh, someone laughs. Someone gets it, right? Okay? What's this deep knowledge thing? There's recently a very scary paper that was written by Jesse Watson. He's a vice president, I think, at Amazon. And the paper is basically about economics, that they're having a hard time interacting with remote workers. And that, in fact, they have data that show that the amount that's paid for non-on-site workers, for remote stay-at-home workers, has been dropping like a rock. Why? Because they're just mercenaries. They're engineers. They're technologists. They don't understand the business. Why don't they understand? Do they not understand the business? Because they're not walking the hallways of the business and picking up on the smell and tastes and sounds of the business on a day-by-day basis. So he asked, why do these projects fail? Well, the most valuable asset in the software industry is the synthesis of programming skill and deep context in the business problem domain in one skull. That's architecture. Are you a banker? Can you cite the business laws? Can you cite the regulations? Do you know when a user comes into the bank and they have a lockbox and they want another lockbox, whether it's the same account or a new account? Do you know that business? As well as knowing how epsilon infinitive. Now you need both in one skull. So programming skill, in the absence of business domain knowledge, is becoming increasingly worthless. This is from one of the fastest growing software giants on the face of the earth. So we're not just engineers. We're not just into the themitas, but we're into the utilitas. How does the end user use this? We're into the venustas. Is this beautiful? Does this cause delight? Does this cause someone to say, wow, that was a great experience working with that program? How many of you have had that experience after making a flight reservation online? Ugh. Oh, you have?
No.
You have a question?
No, I have not had that experience. No, but in terms of the microservice talk we had earlier, to me, microservice is very highly correlated with domain-driven design, which is, in my mind, trying to speak into exactly this, that we need to be very much aligned with the business and the business rules. And I think microservices is just sort of like a shadow of that. It's just an architectural way of
Domain-driven design has no analysis. It's in Eric's book. Eric is a good friend of mine. I keynoted at the conference a few years ago. They do not understand the business. They do not have analysis. They go directly to code from the intuition. RTFM, baby. Read the book.
I have read the book.
Yeah. There's no analysis in DDD. And this is what I'm seeing with microservices. So I and my little island here, based on what I know, can create this thing I think works. And no one understands the system as a whole. And architects are about understanding the form of the whole. This is not architecture. Rebecca Werfsbrock, 40 years ago, said a bag of objects is not an object-oriented architecture. Now we call them microservices.
So, if this is really, something we should trust, how come there isn't a name for these programmers that are more valuable than those that are staying in the
Oh,
We don't distinguish. We go looking for programmers, we go looking for architects, whereas, as I understand this, what you really should be looking at is actually is people who have a broader understanding of the whole area, but they need a name.
there actually is a name for it. I just ran across it the other day, but I can't remember what it is. And it's based on the fact of some studies. There are some programmers who are 10,000 times as good as others. And in Silicon Valley, they actually have a name for these. And I can't remember what it is. But I'm not in the business of hiring programmers. But yeah, I mean, these people have a name. I mean, I started Borland Quattro Pro for Windows. I've studied a group of 12 of these people. 1.3 million lines of high-quality code in 31 months. Second maintenance release very quickly. Very high quality. Great trade press reviews. These people were world-class experts in that business. So yeah, we have a name for these. And we have a problem finding them. We have a problem assessing them. Because we say, please solve this sorting problem in Java. Great, you've done it, you're an architect.
Donald Knuth once said in relation with an algorithm, beware of bugs in the following algorithm. I've only proven it correct, not tested.
Yep.
So now I'm going to say some things. I don't have research. I'm a programmer. I don't have time for research. I don't do formal proofs, even if I have a PhD degree in theoretical computer science. So it's based on experience. I think the concept of the system and the whole is outdated. If you're in a large organization, there will be no one understanding the system. It's not humanly possible. So a main trick or main problem is that you have to divide this somehow. And I think the microservices, with all their problems, have some fresh ideas and good ideas. And I think that in organizations, I think the safe way of doing things is not the answer.
I totally disagree. And I think you said it all. You're not a researcher, you're a programmer, and though you don't do research, you can probably read the research, and you can certainly read code. Please read your code, then you may understand it.
Well, I'm an architect. We have actually done some research and published it. And I will very much support what you're saying, that large organizations are very complex. And it's all about counterweight law for me. But if you split your system according to organizational accountability, you reduce technical debt and make it less
No.
complex.
Let's measure technical debt. I'll bet if I measured the duplication of code across your microservices, particularly if I have 1,800 of them.
So it's a piece of
So I'll cite some research by Brenda Baker and Bell Labs where they were doing this on the 5ESS switch, and they found that 40% of the code in the system integrity subsystem was duplicated elsewhere in the system integrity subsystem for blocks of code 13 lines and longer. That's technical debt.
but there was technical
Order in the house.
This is great. But yeah, I should.
Please write a small note. We will have lots of time to discuss later.
But I love these, and I respect your input and respect your position. This will be a great conversation for later. But let me finish up here. Let's finish up here. Vi vil prøve at være færdig for klokken 10. Er det okay? Så jeg skal fortsætte lige nu. Okay. What can we do to better support change? I want POs to do domain analysis to understand the whole system. Now, if we are indeed moving into a phase where understanding the system isn't important, then architects, whose job it is to understand the system, don't exist. And that's fine. But this requires the end-user culture and market dynamics, not just the technology, because we want the structure to reflect the end-user model for the sake of usability. Now, how can we understand end users? Well, there's an outward focus and an inward focus. How many of you use user stories? How many of you use Scrum? There are no user stories in Scrum. It's a product backlog, not a requirements backlog. What the product owner puts on the product backlog are definitions of product increments, not requirements, not user stories. Otherwise, they're just a product manager. So what I want is user narratives, or even better, user profiles, to really understand a market segment. Again, this is market research. A programmer better be doing market research. I'm using feedback and prototypes to elicit or confirm the mental models that underlie my architecture. Otherwise, it's just a random walk. Oh, and this is the Agile people's story. Take a random walk and then use feedback to eventually home in on something that really works. Yeah, like that's going to work. The inward focus is reflecting the end-user mental model in the architecture. I should be able to look at my architecture and say, this is the end-user model. This is the essence of the direct manipulation metaphor. So this is like real object-oriented development, like the DCI paradigm that Trygve Reinskog and I have been developing over the past 12 years. This is like JavaScript, not Java. Okay? We want the systems to really have dynamics. And too often, what architects will do is just say the dynamics are, well, here's this use case. They don't understand dynamics in types. But that's what the mental model is all about. That is what object-oriented programming originally was. That's even what the original switching architectures were. I started my career in Bell Labs. And they had this dynamic typing that would allow different entities to take on a different behavior according to whether I was involving them in call processing or recovery or diagnostics or one of other 20 kinds of type areas. So we've lost this because we've simplified. Bringing them together, break down the wall between the business domain expertise and implementation exercise expertise. This is business expertise and technical expertise together in one skull. And the hard part isn't the technology. This is, again, from this Amazon paper. The #1 failure of the software industry is in building the wrong product. So this comes down to no more architects. Now, I treasure my domain experts because I treasure domain expertise in the business, in the technologies, because we need to know how to use the tools, and we need to understand the psychological, sociological, and business mores of end-user behavior. And last, I want to make this expertise pervasive on the team so that people can make the minute-by-minute decisions rather than having to work in a centralized way. And this, of course, is what Agile is about.
Sorry, so no more architects, that's your recommendation to say we will have no more architects. Is that correct?
I will say it's an observation of what is true today. I think in the opening exercise here, we proved that by historic definition of architect, that any architect in history would recognize, that Fred Brooks would recognize, that Jerry Weinberg would recognize, we have very few architects today. It's a title.
But my question is, are you recommending that we get rid of architects, or are you saying there are none today, let's have some?
What I'm saying is, I don't really care about the role of architect. What we need is a pervasive distribution of domain expertise, both in the problems domain and solution domain in one skull. Now, let's call that an architect. Well, let's call it an architect for the sake of answering your question. Okay. Yes, we need more of those. Okay, we don't have them today.
So we should care about architecture as we did.
Yes, yes. Okay. But architecture is far too important to be left to the architects. Architecture is extremely important. It's everything. I want to end with this quote. And this is from, who is this from? It's from an architectural critic named Rybczynski, Witold Rybczynski. He's written some books called Home, The Most Beautiful House in the World. He's an architect, a real architect. It'd be convenient if architecture could be defined as any building designed by an architect. But who's an architect? Formal architectural schooling did not appear until the 19th century. The first English language school in London in 1847, and the first North American university program in 1868. So it's not an architectural profession. We've made it up. Despite the existence of professional schools, for a long time, the relationship between schooling and practice has been kind of ambiguous. Like in Switzerland, you don't need to be an architect to do architecture. For centuries, the difference between master masons, journeyman builders, joiners, dilettantes, gifted amateurs, and architects has been ill-defined. The great Renaissance buildings, for example, were designed by a variety of non-architects. Brunelleschi was trained as a goldsmith, Michelangelo as a sculptor, Da Vinci as a painter, and Alberti as a lawyer. Only Bramante, who was also a painter, had formally studied building. These men are termed architects because, among other things, they created architecture, a tautology which explains nothing. Do you build stuff? We need a balance of domain analysis by product owners, good design, business design by product owners, and solution design by the team to meet the architectural mandate to support change. This is Femmitas. We need good mental models that drive paradigms that reflect them in the architecture. This is Utilitas. And we need hands-on developers involved in everything from domain analysis through design and implementation to delivery. Then we'll have a system that can create delight, that's a joy to use, rather than a, oh, geez, I need to make a taxi reservation, or oh, geez, I need to make a flight reservation. Architecture has always been about making the world a better place. So these are some topics to discuss during Open Space today. I did not provide final answers. I believe about half of what I say. The other half is to provoke you to think and to look at joining you in the discussions today. Thank you very much. Oh, no, we'll take it. Yeah?
I've met many POs who were not capable of doing domain analysis. I have met
Yep, fix it. You suck.
yeah, well, 3 examples, but okay, you get the idea.
Look. I know you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want. But Scrum is all about, well, everyone thinks Scrum is about Kaizen. You're wrong. It's about what the Japanese call Kaikaku, which is radical Kaizen. First thing we're going to do is fire all the managers. Wayne Rossing did this at Google in January 2001. I've been working with Bosch IoT. Bosch IoT fired all their managers. The decisions are all now made by product owners. They have their own building, their own culture. Yeah, they have architecture. They don't have architects. The architecture is done by a team. What part of teamwork do we not understand?
How teams interact.
Yeah. And part of that is, well, a big part of that is cultural. Now, if there's one place where it's going to work, it's Denmark. Denmark is not a country. It's a tribe. Right? And there's a lot more trust and social familiarity in this culture, and in general in the Nordics, than there is, say, in Brazil. You do not want to be on a team in Brazil. This is the national or the International Trust Index, based on survey research about how people trust people in their own cultures and in other cultures. So there's a big hope here for this kind of role to really flourish here in Denmark.
Do you have research that backs up the third recommendation, that if you form a team, beautiful things will emerge? Because some of the examples you've had of so-called architects are renowned for their sort of individual exceptionalism, their exceptional skill and vision and so on.
Like Ian Pei.
Sorry?
Like Ian Pei. So it's necessary, and there's research for that, but not sufficient. So, I mean, there's only a million things you need to get right, right? And as this quote showed earlier from Watson, the main problem we have is not building the right product. Now, one final thing. How many of you have read Lean Startup? It's a terrible book, except it's worth the price of the book on about page 5, where he says people believe that great products come from a great vision or a great product, and they fail because they don't have this vision and a great product. He says that has nothing to do with it. And this is written by a guy who's successfully taken 3 or 4 startups. He says it's who does the accounting, who makes sure the doors are locked up at night, who cleans the coffee machine. It's the dirty little stuff. The tradition of the architect is the ivory tower god or goddess. And in fact, what Christopher Alexander says is a real architect is attentive to granularity down to 1/60th of an inch. Mies van der Rohe, the architect, said God is in the details. James Copeland, the architect, says the devil is in the details. God and the devil are down there in the details fighting it out, and you'd better be down there with them.
I asked because it's a beautiful idea, and it would be great to how to make that happen.
Yep. It's necessary, but unfortunately not sufficient. Time box ended?
Yeah, it's fine.
All right.
Thank you so much.